You think you can just tear me apart on your little stage, Stephen, and I'll sit quietly like some caged animal? Nicolas Cage's voice roared through the phone, trembling with fury, as he gripped the receiver so tightly his knuckles whitened. His words, sharp as a blade, cut through the silence of his dimly lit Los Angeles study, where he sat surrounded by scripts and half-read books on ancient artifacts. The call was to Stephen Colbert, the smug late-night host whose venomous monologue the previous night had ignited this firestorm. Stephen, perched in his New York office, had dared to mock Nicholas's latest film, a passion project about a forgotten explorer, calling it a self-indulgent mess, and Nicholas himself, a has-been chasing ghosts of his own ego. The audience had laughed, but for Nicholas, it was a public execution, a betrayal from someone he'd once considered a friend. The sting wasn't just professional, it was personal. Years ago at a charity gala, Stephen had fawned over Nicholas, praising his intensity, his craft, only to now wield those same traits as weapons. The hypocrisy burned. Nicholas wasn't just angry, he was wounded, his pride shredded on national television. He'd spent decades building a career, taking risks on roles others wouldn't touch, while Stephen, with his polished suit and sharper tongue, played the court jester for ratings. This wasn't just a jab, it was a declaration of war. Nicholas slammed the phone down, his breath heavy, the echo of Stephen's chuckle still ringing in his ears. He could still hear the host's voice, dripping with condescension, dismissing his work as if it were a cheap carnival act. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as memories of their past friendship clawed at him. They'd met at that gala in 2010, shared drinks, swapped stories about the grind of Hollywood versus the grind of late-night TV. Stephen had seemed genuine then, his eyes bright with admiration, not the cold glint they held now on screen. Nicholas paced, his boots thudding on the hardwood floor, his mind racing. He'd poured his soul into that film, a story of a man searching for meaning in a world that forgot him, and Stephen had reduced it to a punchline. The betrayal wasn't just in the words. It was in the laughter, the way Stephen leaned into the camera, inviting millions to join in the mockery. Nicholas's hands shook as he grabbed his car keys. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Stephen had crossed a line, and Nicholas was ready to cross one too. The drive to the airport was a blur, the Los Angeles skyline fading into a haze of red taillights and his own simmering rage. He booked the first flight to New York. His thoughts, a storm of indignation. He imagined confronting Stephen, not in a phone call, but face to face, where the host couldn't hide behind his desk or his audience's laughter. Nicholas wasn't a man who backed down. He'd faced critics, flops, and skeptics, always rising, always fighting. But this felt different. Stephen's attack wasn't just about the film. It was about Nicholas's legacy, his very identity as an artist. The plane's hum couldn't drown out the memory of Stephen's voice, that calculated smirk as he delivered the blow. Nicholas stared out the window, the clouds below like a churning sea, mirroring the chaos inside him. He didn't want an apology. He wanted Stephen to feel the weight of his own cruelty, to understand the cost of his cheap shots. By the time the plane touched down in New York, Nicholas's resolve was ironclad. He hailed a cab, his jaw set, and gave the driver the address of Stephen's studio. The city's pulse matched his own, relentless, unforgiving. As the cab wove through Manhattan's crowded streets, Nicholas's mind sharpened, plotting his next move. He wouldn't storm the stage like some unhinged lunatic. He'd be calculated, confront Stephen in his own territory after the cameras stopped rolling. The thought of seeing Stephen's face, stripped of its smug armor, fueled him. The cab pulled up to the studio, its marquee glowing with Stephen's name, a taunt in neon. Nicholas paid the driver and stepped out, his heart pounding like a war drum. The doorman barely glanced at him, waving him through with a bored nod. Inside, the hallways buzzed with staff, but Nicholas moved like a shadow, his eyes fixed on the green room where he knew Stephen would be after the show. The air was thick with tension, his every step a promise of reckoning. He reached the door, his hand hovering over the handle, when a voice behind him said, "Mr. Cage, you're not supposed to be here." It was a young producer, nervous, clutching a clipboard. Nicholas turned, his gaze fierce enough to silence the kid. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he growled, pushing the door open. The green room door swung open, and Nicolas Cage stepped into a space that reeked of stale coffee and smug confidence. Stephen was there, lounging on a leather couch, tie loosened, laughing with a couple of writers who froze when they saw Nicolas. The host's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he registered the storm in Nicholas's face. "Nick, what the hell are you doing here?" Stephen's voice was sharp, not with fear but with irritation, as if Nicholas were an uninvited guest crashing his private party. The writers scurried out, sensing the air crackle with hostility. Nicholas didn't move closer, not yet. He stood, tall, his presence filling the room like a gathering thundercloud. "You think you can gut me on your show, Stephen? And I'll just take it?" His words were low, deliberate, each one a jab. Stephen leaned back, crossing his arms, his lips curling into that familiar smirk, the one that had mocked Nicholas's life's work to millions. "It's just comedy, Nick. Don't take it so personally." The dismissal was gasoline on Nicholas's fire, his fists clenching as he took a step forward, his voice rising. "Comedy? You called my work trash, my passion a joke, and you expect me to laugh?" Stephen stood, his casual posture gone, replaced by a defensive stance, his eyes glinting with something colder than amusement. "You're in my house now, Nick. You don't get to barge in and play the victim. Your movie tanked because it's you, not because of me." The words were a slap, meant to wound, and they did. Nicholas's chest tightened. Memories of sleepless nights of pouring his heart into that film, flashing before him. He'd trusted Stephen once, believed in their camaraderie, but now he saw the truth. Stephen thrived on tearing others down to prop himself up. The room felt like a pressure cooker, the tension thick enough to choke on. Nicholas's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "You're a coward, Stephen. Hiding behind your desk, your audience, your clever little lines. You don't know what it takes to create, to risk everything." Stephen laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and stepped closer, his face inches from Nicholas's. "Risk? You're a walking caricature, Nick. You think you're some tortured artist, but you're just a guy who makes bad choices and calls it genius." The air between them crackled, two men locked in a battle of wills, neither willing to back down. Nicholas's mind raced, his anger warring with a deeper hurt, the sting of betrayal from someone he'd once respected. He could see it in Stephen's eyes, the smug certainty that he'd won this round, that Nicholas would storm out, defeated. But Nicholas wasn't here to lose. He took a breath, steadying himself, and leaned in, his voice a razor. "You're nothing without your stage, Stephen. Out here, no cameras, no script. You're just a man who's forgotten how to be decent." Stephen's smirk twitched, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but he recovered quickly, jabbing a finger at Nicholas. "You want to talk decency? Look at yourself storming in here like some unhinged maniac. You're proving my point, Nick." The words were venom, but Nicholas saw the crack in Stephen's armor, the way his eyes darted to the door as if hoping for rescue. Before Nicholas could fire back, the door opened again, and a security guard stepped in, his bulk filling the frame. "Mr. Cage, you need to leave. Now." Stephen waved a hand, dismissive, as if Nicholas were a minor inconvenience. "Yeah, Nick, go home. This tantrum's getting old." But Nicholas didn't budge, his gaze locked on Stephen, a fire burning in his chest. He wasn't leaving until Stephen felt the weight of his words, until he understood the cost of his cruelty. "This isn't over," Nicholas said, his voice steady, a promise more than a threat. He turned, brushing past the guard, who didn't dare touch him, and strode down the hallway, his boots echoing like gunshots. Outside, the New York night was cold, but Nicholas's blood ran hot. He wasn't done with Stephen. Not by a long shot. He'd find a way to make the host face the consequences, not just for the jab, but for the betrayal, for turning their past friendship into a weapon. As he stepped into the street, a plan began to form, one that would hit Stephen where it hurt most: his reputation, his pride, his stage. Nicolas Cage stood on the sidewalk outside Stephen's studio, the New York night biting at his skin, but his mind was ablaze with purpose. The confrontation in the green room had only sharpened his resolve. Stephen's smug dismissal, his refusal to acknowledge the wound he'd inflicted, fueled Nicholas's determination to strike back. He wouldn't stoop to petty revenge, no fistfights or public outbursts. No, he'd hit Stephen where it hurt most: his carefully crafted image as the charming, untouchable host. Nicholas knew the game. Stephen thrived on his audience's adoration, his reputation as the witty everyman. But that armor had cracks, and Nicholas was ready to pry them open. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found Ellen, a producer he'd worked with years ago, now at a rival network. She'd always admired his grit, his refusal to conform, and she'd jumped at the chance to have him on her show. Nicholas dialed her number, his voice low but steady as he pitched his idea. A raw, unfiltered interview, live, where he'd expose Stephen's cruelty, not with anger, but with truth. Ellen didn't hesitate. "Nick, you're on. Tomorrow night. Let's make it real." The call ended, and Nicholas felt a surge of triumph, the first step of his plan locked in place. By morning, the city buzzed with rumors. Word of Nicholas's late-night visit to Stephen's studio had leaked, whispered among crew members and amplified by industry insiders. Nicholas didn't care. Let them talk. He spent the day preparing, not with scripts or rehearsed lines, but by digging into memories of Stephen's betrayal, the way he'd twisted their friendship into a punchline. At Ellen's studio, the atmosphere was electric, the crew sensing something big was coming. Nicholas arrived early, his presence commanding, his eyes sharp with intent. Ellen greeted him with a firm handshake, her voice low. "You sure about this, Nick? It's live, no net." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I'm not here to play nice, Ellen. I'm here to set things straight." The stage was simple, just 2 chairs and a table, no flashy set to hide behind. As the countdown to airtime began, Nicholas felt the weight of the moment, not nerves, but clarity. He wasn't just defending his film or his career, he was defending his right to create, to take risks, to be more than a caricature in Stephen's cruel narrative. The show went live, and Ellen didn't waste time. "Nicolas Cage, you've been in the headlines, not for your latest film, but for a feud with Stephen Colbert. What's the story?" The audience leaned in, their silence heavy with anticipation. Nicholas didn't flinch, his voice steady but laced with fire. "Stephen called my work a joke, said I'm chasing ghosts. But let's talk about him. He builds his career on tearing people down, on making pain a punchline. I trusted him once, thought he was a friend. But he's a man who'd rather mock than understand." The audience gasped, some nodding, others whispering. Nicholas leaned forward, his eyes locked on the camera, speaking to Stephen through the lens. "You think you're untouchable, Stephen, but you're not. You hurt people, and you don't care, because it gets you laughs. But I'm here, and I'm not laughing." Ellen didn't interrupt, letting the moment breathe, the raw honesty of Nicholas's words sinking in. Social media wasn't mentioned, but the older audience, familiar with pride and betrayal, felt the sting of his truth. Calls flooded the studio switchboard, viewers praising Nicholas's courage, others stunned by his takedown of Stephen's persona. Across town, Stephen watched the broadcast in his office, his face pale, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. He'd underestimated Nicholas, thought he'd slink away, humiliated. But this was a direct hit, a public unmasking. Stephen's team scrambled, urging him to respond, to spin it as a misunderstanding, but he sat silent, his confidence shaken. Nicholas's words weren't just a rebuttal. They were a mirror, forcing Stephen to see the cost of his cruelty. As Nicholas left the stage to thunderous applause, he felt lighter, not because he'd won, but because he'd spoken his truth. The fight wasn't over. Stephen would surely retaliate. But Nicholas was ready. He'd exposed the real Stephen, and the world was watching. He stepped into the night, the city's hum matching the fire in his chest, knowing the next move was Stephen's, and he'd be waiting. Nicolas Cage stepped out of Ellen's studio into the Manhattan night. The applause, still echoing in his ears, a steady pulse of vindication driving his steps. The city's restless energy matched his own, but now it felt like an ally, not a battleground. His live interview had ripped the mask off Stephen's polished persona, and the response was immediate. Phone lines at the studio were jammed. Viewers, calling in to praise Nicholas's raw honesty, to share their own stories of being mocked or dismissed. He'd struck a chord, not just with fans, but with anyone who'd ever felt belittled by someone hiding behind charm. Nicholas didn't check his phone. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift, the tide turning against Stephen. But he wasn't naive. Stephen wouldn't stay quiet. A man like that, cornered, would come out swinging. Nicholas headed to a quiet diner nearby, the kind of place where nobody cared about fame, just coffee and truth. He sat in a corner booth, ordering a black coffee, his mind already bracing for Stephen's counterattack. Across town, Stephen's office was chaos. His team buzzed around him, tossing out ideas, damage control, a public apology, maybe a cheeky monologue to laugh it off. But Stephen sat motionless, staring at the blank TV screen where Nicholas's face had just been, his words still burning. "He called me a coward," Stephen muttered, his voice low almost to himself. His producer, a sharp woman named Claire, leaned in. "You need to respond, Stephen. Tomorrow's show. Turn this around, make it a joke." But Stephen shook his head, his eyes hard. "No jokes. Not this time." He'd misjudged Nicholas, thought he could jab and dodge without consequence. Now his reputation was cracking, viewers questioning if the witty host was just a bully in a suit. Stephen stood, pacing, his mind racing for a way to reclaim control. He wouldn't apologize. That was weakness. But he'd face Nicholas, not on Ellen's stage, but his own. He told Claire to get the word out. Nicholas was invited to his show tomorrow night. No ambush, no tricks, just a conversation. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but Stephen's tone left no room for debate. The next day, the news spread like wildfire. Nicholas got the call from Claire while eating breakfast at the diner. "Stephen wants you on the show tonight. Live. He says, it's to talk, clear the air." Nicholas's gut twisted, not with fear but suspicion. Stephen didn't do clear the air without an angle. Still, he agreed. This was his chance to finish what he'd started, to stand in Stephen's arena and show the world who the real coward was. The studio was packed that night, the audience buzzing with anticipation, sensing a showdown. Nicholas arrived early, his presence quiet but commanding, his eyes scanning the set like a general before battle. Stephen greeted him backstage, no smirk this time, just a tight nod. "Let's keep this civil, Nick," he said, his voice clipped. Nicholas met his gaze, unflinching. "You started this, Stephen. I'm just ending it." The tension was a living thing, coiling between them as they took their places on stage, the audience holding its breath. When the cameras rolled, Stephen didn't open with his usual quips. He looked at Nicholas, his face serious, and said, "You called me out, Nick. Said I'd tear people down. Maybe you're right." The admission stunned the crowd, but Nicholas stayed stone-faced, waiting for the catch. Stephen continued, his voice, steady but strained. I mocked your work, and I shouldn't have. But you came after my whole career, my character. That's not fair either. Nicholas leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. Fair? You betrayed a friendship, Stephen. You used my passion as a punchline for your ego. That's not comedy. That's cruelty. The audience was silent, riveted, as the two men laid bare their grievances. Stephen's charm faltered, his eyes betraying a flicker of regret, but he pressed on, admitting his jab was personal, not just professional. Nicholas didn't gloat. He nodded, accepting the truth, and offered his own. I'm not perfect, Stephen. I take risks, I fail, but I don't hide. You did. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a roar of respect for the raw honesty. Stephen extended a hand and Nicholas took it, not as friends, but as men who'd faced their flaws. Nicholas walked off stage, head high, his triumph not in destroying Stephen, but in reclaiming his truth. The world saw it, and that was enough.